The day was overcast, the sky heavy with gray clouds that seemed to mirror the somber mood of the small southern town. Reverend Elijah Johnson, a beloved community leader and mentor to many, had passed away after a long battle with illness. His funeral brought together people from all walks of life: friends, family, neighbors, and even those who had never met him but felt inspired by his legacy of kindness and faith. Among the mourners stood General Marcus Hayes, a towering figure in every sense of the word. Dressed in his immaculate formal military uniform, adorned with rows of medals earned through decades of service, Marcus commanded respect simply by being present. Yet, on this day, he wasn't there as a decorated general or a public figure. He was there as a grieving man paying tribute to the man who had once guided him through some of the toughest moments of his youth. As the ceremony unfolded, Marcus listened intently to the eulogies, each one painting a vivid picture of Reverend Johnson's impact on the community. Memories of their shared past flooded his mind. The countless hours spent sitting in the Reverend's modest study, discussing life, morality, and purpose. Those conversations had shaped Marcus into the person he was today, instilling in him values of resilience, empathy, and leadership. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for having known such a remarkable individual, but also a profound sadness knowing that he would no longer hear the Reverend's calming voice or benefit from his wisdom. The crowd began to disperse slowly as the final prayers concluded, leaving only a handful of close friends and relatives gathered near the graveside. It was then that an unmarked police car rolled up along the edge of the cemetery, its tires crunching softly against the gravel path. Out stepped Officer Greg Thompson, a man whose reputation preceded him. Known for his short temper and abrasive demeanor, Thompson had been the subject of numerous complaints over the years, though none had ever led to serious consequences. Today, however, something about the scene before him set him on edge. Perhaps it was the sight of so many unfamiliar faces in his town. Or maybe it was the presence of someone like Marcus, someone whose stature and authority challenged his own sense of power. Thompson's eyes narrowed as they landed on Marcus. To him, the general didn't belong here. This wasn't just suspicion, it was prejudice cloaked in the guise of law enforcement. Without hesitation, he strode toward the group, his boots thudding loudly against the ground. The murmurs among the mourners faded as they noticed his approach, unease rippling through the air. When he reached Marcus, he stopped abruptly, his posture rigid and confrontational. "Sir," he barked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass, "I need to see your ID." Marcus turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. For a moment, he simply stared at the officer, taking in the aggressive stance and the dismissive glint in his eyes. Then, without raising his voice, he replied, "I'm General Marcus Hayes. I'm here to pay my respects to Reverend Johnson, a man who meant a great deal to me." His words carried weight, not just because of his rank, but because of the sincerity behind them. Anyone listening could tell that Marcus was speaking from the heart, honoring a bond that transcended time and circumstance. But Thompson wasn't interested in stories or explanations. To him, Marcus's polished uniform and confident demeanor were nothing more than distractions. "That doesn't answer my question," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're not from around here, are you? What's your business at this funeral?" His voice grew louder with each syllable, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Some of the mourners exchanged worried glances, sensing that the situation was escalating far too quickly. Others shifted uncomfortably, torn between wanting to intervene and fearing the repercussions if they did. Despite the mounting tension, Marcus remained composed. He understood that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. Instead, he took a measured breath and tried again. "Reverend Johnson was my mentor," he explained, his voice steady. "He helped shape the person I am today. If you'd like, I can provide identification, but I assure you, I have every right to be here." His attempt at reason fell on deaf ears. Thompson's jaw tightened, his hand twitching toward the holster at his side. Whether it was arrogance, fear, or sheer ignorance driving him, he refused to back down. By now, the entire gathering had fallen silent, watching the exchange unfold with bated breath. A few people pulled out their phones, instinctively recording the encounter. One young woman, barely out of her teens, held her device steady, her hands trembling slightly as she captured every detail. She knew what she was witnessing wasn't just a personal conflict. It was a reflection of larger societal issues, ones that couldn't be ignored any longer. As the seconds ticked by, the atmosphere grew heavier, charged with anticipation and dread. No one knew exactly how this confrontation would end, but one thing was certain: it was about to take a turn that none of them would soon forget. The tension between General Marcus Hayes and Officer Greg Thompson continued to escalate, each passing second stretching the atmosphere tighter like a bowstring ready to snap. Marcus's calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate Thompson further. The officer's face reddened as he took another step closer, his body language radiating hostility. "You think your fancy titles make you special?" Thompson sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is my town, and I don't care who you are. Nobody gets away with disrespecting me." Marcus clenched his jaw slightly but kept his composure. He had faced far worse situations in his military career, but this moment felt different. It wasn't just about him. It was about the message this kind of behavior sent to everyone watching. Here he was, a decorated general, standing at the graveside of a man who had dedicated his life to peace and understanding, being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor on the mourners around him, whose faces reflected a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. Thompson's next move shocked even those who already distrusted him. With no warning, he reached for his gun, drawing it from its holster and pointing it directly at Marcus. The metallic click of the safety being released echoed through the cemetery, cutting through the silence like a knife. Gasps erupted from the crowd as people instinctively stepped back, their eyes wide with horror. Some covered their mouths, others clutched their chests, and a few whispered prayers under their breath. The young woman recording the incident nearly dropped her phone, her hands shaking violently as she struggled to keep the camera steady. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Marcus stood perfectly still, his gaze locked onto Thompson's. His mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. He knew that any sudden movement could provoke the trigger-happy officer into firing, but more than that, he understood the symbolism of this moment. If he flinched or showed fear, it would validate Thompson's aggression and reinforce the toxic power dynamic that had brought them to this point. Instead, he chose to stand tall, refusing to let intimidation dictate his actions. His posture remained dignified, his expression unreadable, a mask of strength and resolve. "What exactly are you hoping to achieve here, officer?" Marcus finally asked, his voice calm but firm, carrying an authority that cut through the chaos. "Do you really believe pulling a weapon on a grieving man at a funeral serves any purpose? Or does it just satisfy your need to assert dominance over someone you see as inferior?" His words struck a nerve. Thompson's grip on the gun tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Don't try to lecture me," he spat, his tone laced with venom. "I'm enforcing the law, and if you don't comply, there will be consequences." But Marcus didn't flinch. "Enforcing the law," he repeated, his voice rising slightly, though not out of anger. "Is this what justice looks like to you? Threatening an unarmed man while he pays his respects to a mentor who shaped his life? Tell me, Officer Thompson, what crime have I committed? Today?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across Thompson's face, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. He glanced around at the growing number of phones pointed in his direction, capturing every word and gesture. The realization that this confrontation was being broadcast live to potentially millions of viewers only fueled his frustration. In His mind, these recordings weren't evidence of wrongdoing. They were attacks on his authority, attempts to undermine his role as a protector of order. Meanwhile, the crowd began to murmur among themselves, their voices low but urgent. Some debated whether to intervene, while others urged caution, knowing that escalating the situation further could put Marcus in even greater danger. A few brave souls took tentative steps forward, their intentions unclear, but Thompson immediately raised his voice to stop them. "Stay back," he barked, waving the gun slightly to emphasize his command. "Anyone who interferes will regret it." It was then that Lieutenant Sarah Collins arrived on the scene. She had been patrolling the area when she received a call about a disturbance at the cemetery. When she pulled up and saw the commotion, her instincts kicked in. Stepping out of her patrol car, she assessed the situation quickly. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening: an armed officer threatening a civilian, surrounded by terrified witnesses. This wasn't protocol. It was madness. Collins approached cautiously, her hands visible to show she meant no harm. "Officer Thompson," she called out, her voice clear and authoritative. "What's going on here?" Thompson turned to face her, momentarily distracted. "This man refuses to cooperate," he said, gesturing toward Marcus with the gun. "He's suspicious, and I'm handling it." "Handling it?" Collins repeated, incredulous. "By pointing your weapon at a decorated general?" She moved closer, positioning herself between Thompson and Marcus. The act was bold, almost reckless, but necessary. "Lower your weapon, Greg," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Now." Thompson hesitated, torn between following orders and doubling down on his aggression. For a moment it seemed like he might ignore her entirely, but the weight of Collins' presence and the cameras rolling behind her forced his hand. Reluctantly, he lowered the gun, though his scowl deepened. "Fine," he muttered, holstering the weapon. "But mark my words, this isn't over. The immediate threat may have subsided, but the damage had already been done." The mourners looked shaken, their grief overshadowed by the trauma of witnessing such blatant abuse of power. Marcus, however, remained composed, his expression unchanged. As Collins escorted him away from the scene, ensuring his safety, he couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of what had just transpired. This wasn't just about one racist cop or one tense encounter. It was about the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. And as much as he wanted to focus on honoring Reverend Johnson's memory, he knew that this moment would demand action, not silence. As the crowd began to disperse, whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into conversations. Phones continued to record, texts were sent, and social media feeds lit up with updates. What started as a quiet funeral in a small southern town was about to become a national headline, one that would force America to confront uncomfortable truths about race, authority, and justice. As Lieutenant Sarah Collins stepped between General Marcus Hayes and Officer Greg Thompson, the tension in the cemetery reached a boiling point. The air was thick with emotion, fear, anger, disbelief, all swirling together like a storm about to break. Collins' presence brought a fleeting sense of relief to the crowd, but it also introduced a new layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Her decision to intervene wasn't just courageous, it was risky. By positioning herself between a fellow officer and his target, she had crossed an invisible line within law enforcement culture, a code that often prioritized loyalty over morality. Thompson's face twisted into a scowl as he realized what Collins was doing. "Stay out of this, Collins," he snapped, his voice low but laced with warning. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," she replied firmly, her eyes locked onto his. "You're pointing a loaded weapon at an unarmed man in front of witnesses. That makes it my business." Her words struck a chord, not just with Thompson, but with everyone watching. The mourners, who had been frozen in shock moments earlier, began to stir. Some nodded approvingly, silently applauding Collins for standing up to her colleague. Others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether her intervention would make things worse. Even Marcus, who had remained stoic throughout the ordeal, allowed himself a brief moment of acknowledgement. He could see the determination in Colin's stance, the way she held her ground despite the obvious danger. It was clear she wasn't going to back down. For Thompson, however, Colin's defiance only deepened his frustration. He felt cornered, not just by her actions but by the growing number of cameras capturing every detail. The live streams had gone viral almost instantly, drawing attention from across the country. Journalists were already speculating about the incident, while activists called for accountability. To Thompson, this scrutiny felt like an attack, a personal vendetta against him and everything he stood for. His grip on the gun tightened again, though he didn't raise it. Instead, he glared at Collins, his jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might crack. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat, his tone dripping with contempt. "You don't know the first thing about keeping order around here. People like him," he jerked his head toward Marcus. "They come into our towns, act like they own the place, and expect us to roll out the red carpet. Well, I'm not rolling anything for anyone." Collins didn't flinch. She took a step closer, her voice steady but sharp. "People like him? You mean people who've served their country honorably, who've risked their lives to protect the freedoms we all enjoy? Is that who you're talking about, Greg?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to find the right words. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed uncertain, his confidence wavering under the weight of Colin's logic. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression. "I'm enforcing the law," he growled. "If you've got a problem with that, take it up with the chief." "I'll do more than that," Collins shot back without hesitation. "But right now, you need to holster your weapon and step away. This is over." The two officers stared at each other, their wills clashing like swords in battle. Around them, the crowd watched in stunned silence, holding their collective breath. Would Thompson comply, or would he escalate further? The answer came slowly, reluctantly. With visible effort, he holstered his gun and took a step back, though his body language made it clear he wasn't happy about it. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But don't think this changes anything." With the immediate threat neutralized, Collins turned her attention to Marcus. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, her tone softening. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he said simply. "Thank you for stepping in." Collins gave him a small nod, though her eyes betrayed a mix of emotions: admiration for his composure, guilt for the system that had allowed this to happen, and resolve to ensure something like this never happened again. "Let's get you somewhere safe," she suggested, gesturing toward her patrol car. "We can talk more there." As they walked away, leaving Thompson standing alone amidst the murmuring crowd, the gravity of the moment settled over everyone present. For the mourners, the funeral had taken a dark turn, transforming from a celebration of Reverend Johnson's life into a stark reminder of the racial tensions that still plagued their community. Many of them couldn't help but wonder how such hatred could exist in a place meant for healing and remembrance. Some whispered prayers, others hugged loved ones tightly, seeking comfort in shared grief. A few approached Marcus and Collins, offering words of support and gratitude for their courage. Meanwhile, the live stream continued to spread like wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags like #Justice for General Hayes and #Wanaochu Accountability Now began trending on social media platforms. Viewers expressed outrage, disbelief, and sadness, flooding comment sections with calls for action. Activists seized the opportunity to highlight systemic racism within law enforcement, sharing statistics and personal stories to underscore the urgency of reform. Journalists scrambled to piece together details of the incident, reaching out to local officials and eyewitnesses for statements. Even national news outlets picked up the story, airing clips of the confrontation alongside interviews with experts on race relations and police misconduct. Back at the cemetery, Thompson stood isolated, his earlier bravado replaced by simmering resentment. He knew he was in trouble. The videos, the witnesses, the public outcry all pointed to consequences he couldn't escape. Yet, instead of reflecting on his actions, he doubled down on his beliefs, convinced that he was the victim of a biased system. As other officers arrived on the scene to assess the situation, he launched into a defensive tirade, blaming everyone except himself for the mess he had created. His colleagues listened quietly, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright disapproval. None of them defended him openly, but neither did they challenge him directly. In that moment, the fractures within the department became painfully clear. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the cemetery, the crowd finally dispersed. The graveside lay quiet once more, save for the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. But the impact of what had transpired lingered, etched into the memories of those who had witnessed it. For Marcus, the day had shifted from one of mourning to one of resilience. He had endured countless challenges throughout his life, both in uniform and out. But this experience carried a unique weight. It reminded him of the work that still needed to be done, not just for himself, but for future generations. And for Sarah Collins, the choice she had made would define her career, and perhaps her life, for years to come. Standing up to a fellow officer wasn't easy, especially when it meant challenging deeply ingrained biases and practices. But as she drove Marcus to safety, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had done the right thing. Whether it led to praise or punishment, she knew she couldn't have stayed silent. Sometimes doing the right thing meant taking a stand, even when it felt like the entire world was watching. The aftermath of the cemetery confrontation spread like wildfire, igniting a national conversation that no one could ignore. By morning, the video of Officer Greg Thompson pulling his weapon on General Marcus Hayes had been viewed millions of times. Social media platforms were flooded with reactions. Outrage, disbelief, and calls for justice dominated the discourse. News anchors across the country led their broadcasts with footage of the incident, dissecting every detail while inviting experts to weigh in. The story wasn't just about one man's encounter with a racist cop. It was a mirror reflecting the deep-seated issues within law enforcement and society as a whole. As the hours passed, protests began to form outside the local police station. What started as a small group of concerned citizens quickly grew into a massive demonstration, drawing people from neighboring towns and cities. Signs bearing slogans like "Enough is enough" and "Justice over bias" filled the air, while chants echoed through the streets. Protesters demanded accountability, not only for Thompson, but for the system that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. Some carried portraits of Reverend Elijah Johnson, linking his legacy of peace and equality to the fight against systemic racism. Others held up images of General Marcus Hayes, honoring his service and resilience in the face of injustice. Inside the police department, tensions ran high. Officers who had once dismissed complaints about Thompson now found themselves under intense scrutiny. Internal investigations were launched almost immediately, though many doubted they would lead to meaningful change. Lieutenant Sarah Collins became a focal point of both praise and criticism. To the public, she was a hero, a rare example of an officer willing to stand up against wrongdoing within her own ranks. But among her colleagues, opinions were divided. Some admired her courage, while others accused her of betrayal, claiming she had undermined the unity of the force. Anonymous messages circulated online, some thanking her for her bravery, others threatening retaliation. For Marcus, the days following the funeral were a whirlwind of emotions. He received countless messages of support from military comrades, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens inspired by his composure during the ordeal. Yet, despite the outpouring of encouragement, he couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thompson's gun pointed at him, heard the murmurs of fear from the crowd, felt the sting of prejudice cutting deeper than any bullet ever could. It wasn't just about him. It was about the message this incident sent to Black Americans everywhere, that even those who served their country with distinction weren't immune to discrimination. Determined to channel his pain into purpose, Marcus agreed to speak at a press conference organized by civil rights advocates. Standing before a sea of cameras and microphones, he addressed the nation with the same calm authority that had defined him throughout the confrontation. "What happened to me isn't unique," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem rooted in fear, ignorance, and inequality. I'm not here to seek revenge or vilify anyone. I'm here to demand accountability and reform. We cannot continue to allow hatred and bias to dictate how we treat one another. Not in our communities, not in our institutions, and certainly not in our law enforcement." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with viewers across the political spectrum. Even critics who typically oppose discussions of systemic racism found themselves moved by his sincerity and restraint. Military leaders issued statements condemning Thompson's actions, emphasizing Marcus's exemplary record and the disrespect shown to a man who had devoted his life to protecting the nation. Meanwhile, grassroots organizations seized the moment to push for policy changes, including mandatory anti-bias training, increased oversight of police conduct, and measures to address racial profiling. The pressure mounted on local officials to take swift action. Within days, Officer Greg Thompson was suspended without pay pending a full investigation. While some hailed this as a step in the right direction, others argued it wasn't enough. Activists pointed out that suspensions often amounted to little, more than slaps on the wrist, allowing officers to return to duty after brief absences. They called for Thompson's termination and criminal charges, insisting that accountability required more than symbolic gestures. Lawyers representing the victims of past misconduct filed lawsuits against the department, citing patterns of abuse and negligence. The legal battles promised to drag on for months, if not years, but the momentum for change showed no signs of slowing. Amid the chaos, Lieutenant Sarah Collins faced her own challenges. Her superiors praised her for diffusing a potentially deadly situation, but privately questioned whether her actions had damaged the department's reputation. Some suggested transferring her to a less visible role, hoping to minimize the attention she continued to attract. Yet Collins refused to back down. In interviews, she spoke candidly about the need for transparency and reform within law enforcement. "Being a police officer isn't just about wearing a badge or carrying a gun," she said during one appearance. "It's about serving and protecting everyone, not just the people who look like you or share your beliefs. If we can't hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect the public to trust us?" Her outspokenness earned her both allies and enemies. Supporters rallied around her, organizing fundraisers to cover potential legal fees and creating petitions to ensure she kept her job. Critics labeled her a traitor, accusing her of tarnishing the reputation of her fellow officers. Despite the backlash, Collins remained steadfast, knowing that silence would only perpetuate the cycle of abuse and mistrust. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of the incident rippled far beyond the small southern town where it had occurred. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing accountability for law enforcement agencies, while community groups hosted dialogues to foster understanding between residents and police. Schools incorporated lessons on racial bias and empathy into their curriculums, hoping to plant seeds of change in younger generations. Even corporate America took notice, with several companies pledging funds to support initiatives promoting equity and inclusion. Yet, amidst the progress, reminders of the work still needed persisted. Reports of similar incidents surfaced regularly, underscoring the pervasive nature of the problem. For Marcus, these stories reinforced his commitment to advocacy. He traveled the country, speaking at rallies, conferences, and town halls, urging people to remain vigilant in the pursuit of justice. His message was simple, yet powerful. Real change required collective effort, unwavering determination, and an unshakable belief in humanity's capacity for growth. By year's end, the case against Thompson reached its conclusion. After a lengthy trial marred by heated debates and conflicting testimonies, he was convicted of misconduct and sentenced to probation, effectively ending his career in law enforcement. While the punishment fell short of what many had hoped for, it marked a rare instance of accountability, a victory, however small, for those fighting for reform. For Lieutenant Sarah Collins, the journey was far from over. She became a symbol of hope for officers seeking to challenge the status quo, proving that standing up for what's right didn't have to mean standing alone. Though her path remained fraught with obstacles, she embraced the role thrust upon her, determined to leave a lasting legacy of integrity and courage. And for General Marcus Hayes, the experience transformed him in ways he never anticipated. Once content to let his service speak for itself, he now understood the importance of using his platform to amplify marginalized voices. As he stood before crowds of supporters, sharing his story and advocating for change, he realized that true leadership wasn't about titles or accolades. It was about inspiring others to believe in a better future and empowering them to help build it. Months after the cemetery confrontation, the small southern town where it all began had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The once quiet community now found itself at the center of a national reckoning on race, accountability, and justice. Protest signs still lined the streets outside the police station, though they were fewer in number now. The crowds that gathered daily had dwindled, but their voices echoed louder than ever through social media campaigns, petitions, and grassroots movements. For General Marcus Hayes, Lieutenant Sarah Collins, and countless others touched by the incident, the journey toward lasting change was far from over. But there were glimmers of hope. The most significant changes came within the police department itself. Under mounting public pressure, local officials implemented sweeping reforms aimed at addressing systemic issues. Mandatory anti-bias training became a cornerstone of the new policies, with officers required to attend workshops led by civil rights. Experts and psychologists specializing in implicit bias. Body cameras were distributed to every officer, ensuring transparency during interactions with the public. An independent oversight board was established, composed of community members tasked with reviewing complaints against law enforcement and recommending disciplinary actions. These measures weren't perfect. Some argued they didn't go far enough, but they represented a step forward in rebuilding trust between the police force and the people they served. Officer Greg Thompson's case served as a cautionary tale for departments across the country. His conviction sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles, forcing officers to confront uncomfortable truths about misconduct and accountability. While some defended him privately, claiming he was made an example of because of his high-profile mistake, others acknowledged that his behavior reflected deeper flaws within the system. Training sessions began incorporating discussions about unchecked aggression and racial profiling, encouraging officers to reflect on their own biases and how those biases influence their work. It wasn't easy. Many resisted the introspection required, but slowly attitudes started to shift. For Lieutenant Sarah Collins, life hadn't returned to normal, if normal even existed anymore. Her decision to intervene at the cemetery had turned her into a household name, celebrated by some and vilified by others. Within the department, she faced isolation from colleagues who viewed her as a traitor. Some refused to partner with her on patrols, while others whispered behind her back, questioning her loyalty. Yet, despite the backlash, Collins remained resolute. She knew standing up for what was right often meant standing alone, and she was willing to pay that price if it meant paving the way for others to follow. Her courage inspired a growing movement among younger officers eager to redefine what it meant to serve and protect. They formed support networks, sharing resources and strategies for advocating reform without jeopardizing their careers. Collins became their unofficial mentor, offering guidance and encouragement when needed. Together, they worked to create a culture of accountability, one where speaking out against injustice wasn't seen as divisive, but as essential to maintaining public trust. Their efforts gained traction, leading to statewide discussions about implementing similar reforms in other jurisdictions. General Marcus Hayes, meanwhile, embraced his role as a voice for change. No longer content to let his military achievements speak for themselves, he dedicated himself to advocacy work, traveling across the nation to share his story. His speeches resonated deeply with audiences, drawing standing ovations wherever he went. At a civil rights summit held in Washington, D.C., he delivered a keynote address that left attendees moved to tears. "We cannot undo the past," he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "But we can shape the future. We can choose to see each other not as enemies or threats, but as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. That choice starts with accountability, not just for individuals, but for institutions." His words struck a chord, sparking renewed calls for legislative action. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing federal oversight of local police departments, mandating data collection on use-of-force incidents, and establishing clear guidelines for handling cases of misconduct. While passing these laws proved challenging, the momentum generated by Marcus's advocacy kept the conversation alive. Activists organized rallies, marches, and vigils, keeping pressure on elected officials to act. Slowly but surely, progress began to take root. Back in the small southern town, Reverend Elijah Johnson's memory continued to inspire healing and unity. A memorial park was built near the cemetery where the confrontation had occurred, featuring a statue of the Reverend surrounded by benches and flower gardens. Community events were held there regularly: poetry readings, gospel concerts, and discussions about racial reconciliation. Residents, regardless of background, came together to honor his legacy and commit to building a more inclusive society. For many, the park became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could prevail. As time passed, Marcus found solace in knowing that Reverend Johnson's teachings lived on through the actions of those inspired by his story. He often visited the memorial park, sitting quietly beneath the shade of its trees and reflecting on how far things had come, and how much further they still needed to go. Change was never linear, setbacks were inevitable, and resistance persisted. But Marcus believed deeply in humanity's capacity for growth, especially when guided by compassion and understanding. Lieutenant Sarah Collins shared this belief. Though her career remained fraught with challenges, she took pride in knowing she had done the right thing, even when it cost her dearly. Her bond with Marcus grew stronger over time, forged by their shared commitment to justice. Together, they collaborated on initiatives aimed at bridging divides between law enforcement and marginalized communities. They spoke at conferences, wrote op-eds, and met with policymakers, urging them to prioritize equity and fairness in all aspects of governance. By year's end, the impact of their efforts rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the borders of the small southern town. Schools incorporated lessons on empathy and inclusion into their curriculums. Businesses pledged funds to support underrepresented groups, and churches hosted interfaith dialogues to foster mutual understanding. While racism and inequality remained pervasive issues, the collective will to address them grew stronger with each passing day. In the end, the story of General Marcus Hayes, Lieutenant Sarah Collins, and the cemetery confrontation stood as a testament to the power of courage and resilience. It reminded everyone involved that true progress required not just policy changes but shifts in mindset, willingness to listen, learn, and grow. As Marcus often said in his speeches, justice isn't something we achieve overnight. It's something we build together, brick by brick, until the walls of division crumble and give way to unity. And so, as the sun set over the Memorial Park one crisp autumn evening, casting golden hues across the statue of Reverend Elijah Johnson, a sense of cautious optimism filled the air. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a road worth traveling, one paved with hope, determination, and the unwavering belief that a better future was possible.